Okay, so the previous panel was about the ethics of responding to cyber harm, and now that we've seen how complicated it is to figure out how to respond, now the question comes up to whom. We get into the attribution problem and related issues. And to lead us on that, the panel chair is Duncan Hollis, who's the professor of international law and the associate dean for academic affairs at Temple University Law School. And he's authored several articles and essays on cyber threats, including an ESOS for cyberspace in the Harvard International Law Journal. And prior to joining the Temple faculty, he served as in the Office of Legal Advisor in the U.S. Department of State. So he's a very deep background on these issues, and we're thankful to have him. Duncan.
Thanks, Ed. So I want to thank Ed and the Stockdale Center for having us and for convening this this panel. I was pretty excited by it. I actually, my first exposure to cyber was in 2001 when I was part of the U.S. delegation that negotiated the final clauses to the only existing international law treaty on cyber, the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. And there was a lot of negotiations there about this new threat and the new tools and the need for new rules to deal with this threat as criminals moved into cyberspace, both to commit old-fashioned crimes and to commit new types of crimes. And one of the nice, easy, gentle things we did at the end of the day to make that convention work was we put in literally an explanatory note that said, whatever cybercrime is, anything done by governments is not cybercrime. So we there right then, I think, began to mark the space within which attribution operates, right? Because what we've seen in cybercrime and more recently as we've now built up cybercom and had these robust discussions about what is cyber war and how do you regulate states or actors who are proxies for states is the question of how much who does it matters. And that question also permeates to a third group we haven't really talked much about, is the idea and the notion of cyber terrorism, and that somehow we should differentiate criminals from terrorists, from war fighters, and that we should have different rules and ethics for each group. In fact, as Richard Clark was commenting on his CHEW, an acronym this morning, I actually had a much more graphic image than a Venn diagram, which is what happens when you chew food and what it all mushes together in one's mouth. And in some ways, I think the attribution quote-unquote problem is posed by that, sorry, post-lunch graphic image, is this idea of how do we unpack this? Because so much of the existing rules and ethics are based on knowing who did it. And one of the things this panel is designed to talk about is the different ways we can attribute responsibility for acts. That is what we might call factual attribution. Who actually did it? Do we know, seeing me knock on the table, you all would say, I just knocked on the table. Hearing me knock under the table, you didn't see it, but the context might lead you, the circumstantial evidence might lead you to say that I've knocked on the table. Or hearing that I was at a conference a week ago and knocked on a table. These are the questions that attribution poses, both for ethicists and for lawyers, in determine what legal consequences, or in the military context, what responsibilities active defenses might follow. So I should say, Ed's put together a fabulous panel for us to explore these issues of factual attribution, policy attribution, legal presumptions about attribution that we're going to be hearing about this afternoon. So our first panelist is Randal R. Dipert. He is the C.S. Pierce Professor of Philosophy at the University of Buffalo. I think he has the distinction of being known to many of you because he's been, for 2011 and 2012, an external fellow here at the Stockdale Center at the Naval Academy. He previously taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and his, I guess, earlier work focused on logic, artificial intelligence, and the philosophy of science. More recently, he's begun extensively researching military ethics with papers in the Journal of Military Ethics focused on preemptive and preventive war, game theory, and, appropriately, the ethics of cyber warfare. So we'll start off with Professor Dipert.
Yeah, thank you. For the past year, I've been part of this research group. We've met approximately weekly for an entire afternoon, so this is many, many sessions. We've been an inter-service group with representatives from the Air Force, Navy, the Marine Corps, and I guess I'm the token Army person. We've also been interagency. We've had a very, very competent CIA agent with us and someone else from the NSA and occasional representatives from Cyber Command. This has been an extraordinary intellectual experience for me, one of the best actually in my intellectual career. So I thank Colonels Barrett and Athens for bringing us together. I wanted to first of all say a little something about where I'm coming from. These are sort of summaries of views that frame the wider landscape. I think cyber warfare is not completely addressed by current international law, and we've seen some indications of that on the panel this morning. I think ethical theories of war are actually quite a distinct category, although they're occasionally merged. And I think there, too, there's not a consensus about what the ethical issues are. In particular, there's this issue of level of force. Philosophers are probably more comfortable talking about intentional harm or violation of rights, whereas the lawyers talk about attacks and uses of force. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned, I think, so far in this conference is that we're lacking the kind of theories and strategies, the kind of theories of strategy and conflict that we had for the nuclear era. Sean Cannock, who visited us at the Stockdale Center, pointed out that there's no George Kennan or no Thomas Schelling yet of cyber warfare. And finally, cyber warfare is not now amenable to treaties, either banning or prohibiting their proliferation, although I think there are reasons to believe this might change. Now, the definition of the attribution problem, or what I understand as the attribution problem, is actually rather simple. It's a lack of certainty in the identity of an attacker. It's a lack of real-time knowledge of the identity, and not to the grades of certainty we're used to in the history of warfare. There are, as nearly as I can determine, very few historical incidents where someone has been attacked in a massive and clear attack and they had no idea who it was. There are maybe the bombing of the U.S. Maine in Havana Harbor was such a case. Maybe there have been instances of terrorism that are such cases, or mortars or rockets falling down momentarily where you didn't know from which insurgent group they might have come. So this is a rare problem and not usually addressed. Specifically, the definition of the attribution problem is the lack of certainty sufficient as a casus belli in real time and by technical means alone. The current real-time forensic tools don't seem to produce clear sources for the malware in terms of a specific IP address or even a specific computer. And this is because of the problems of spoofing, sort of swapping out names in packets, pivoting. You use somebody else's computer in a third nation to attack. Or if you set up a giant botnet and the identity of the bot master may be hidden to you. Many times in attacks, one doesn't know for weeks or months that one has been attacked. Verizon, in their 2011 study of data breaches, pointed out that and these were commercial vendors of data breaches in their huge Tier 1 network. 75% of them were not identified within weeks or months of the attack. So this is another source of uncertainty. You may have been attacked months ago and don't know it now. Now, reliable prompt attribution would be necessary for a whole range of actions. One is just public condemnation of the attacker, perhaps a legal protest to the Security Council or to the International Court of Justice, diplomatic or economic retaliation, what I consider soft force, or a cyber counterattack, or retaliation against another enemy attack. And in the worst case, the sort of Article 51 kind of case, you might want to launch a full-scale cyber or kinetic attack against an attacker. But it's very difficult to launch attacks if you don't know against whom. And finally, for deterrence, it's quite important. The U.S. has not, so far as I know, taken any of these public steps, not even outright public condemnation. The closest it's come, I think, was Secretary of State Clinton about a year ago, identified China as the source of some problems. That was mainly in the Google controversy. So really, our attackers have not been specifically called out with any great clarity, and certainly there haven't been protests. What I see as the failure of current policy is, now this is the other side of the coin from Richard Clark's comments this morning. I think to a large extent we've had almost exclusive emphasis on cybersecurity defense, and I would consider that to be analogous to having a nuclear bomb shelter policy in the 1950s. That is hardening the sites and trying to hunker down and avoid getting hit. Now, the problem with that, and it's a serious problem, Admiral McConnell has pointed this out, is that an attacker only needs to spend about a tenth as much money in making you build up resources of cybersecurity and target hardening that may be 10 times as much. And right now, estimates of cybersecurity costs are in the tens of billions, but I think we could reasonably expect them to climb into the hundreds of billions within 50 or 10 years. Right now, about 45 billion, and that's commercial sites and the federal government, but without DOD. And the question that I want to pose is, would deterrence be better, or at least a much cheaper policy? Another thing the U.S. hasn't done is that we've talked about our offensive capability, but it has not been demonstrated. Unfortunately, some sort of demonstration or proof is necessary for deterrence. And another problem is that allowing cyber attacks to continue without protest on us risk it becoming a customary part of international law that's simply accepted. So the first one who launches a counterattack, they're going to say, why did you do this? For years we've been attacked and nobody counterattacked. Here's a graph I have of this data is quite hard to get, and I'm not sure of its reliability, but this is the best I could do. This is consolidated federal cybersecurity spending for 2011, I think. And as you can see, it's nudging above 10 billion. This excludes classified DoD spending, such as NSA, so there are huge chunks of that not showing. And it doesn't include local and government support. Some of this, of course, is protection against data breaches and cyber crime, not just nation-on-nation attacks. The commercial market has likewise seen these huge increases with, as you see, the financial services sector being the largest one. And altogether, without Defense Department spending and without consumer antivirus software, we're talking about roughly $45 billion a year in the best estimates. Now, one thing I think we need to shift to in the attribution problem is to move from having the kind of certainty we've expected and usually had in the past to something a little weaker, and I call that reasonable certainty of attribution, so that we can increase the probability of timely, correct attribution. And one way we can augment our purely technical information about which IP addresses or IP or country domains or what styles of malware we're seeing is to add to that information about various countries' motives and cyberware offensive capabilities. We'll often have that from humans and signal intelligence, so that it's not just, we don't get these attacks with no background at all. We could also have a history of securely attributed attacks from the past, which would document someone's track record in attacking us. Another possibility would be to slow the counterattack, would be to, if we do have this reasonable certainty, we might make the accusation and allow the party to come forward with some disconfirming evidence if they could. Now, the attribution without near certainty is, I think, in some ways like another controversial area in morality of war, and that's preemptive and preventive war. I've described this issue as epistemic, in not knowing with as much certainty as we'd hope. In the attribution problems for cyber warfare, it's a lack of certainty about who has attacked us. And in the case of preemptive or preventive war, it's a case of lack of certainty about whether an enemy will attack us in the future. So they share some of the same problems. The epistemic problem of cyber warfare and of preemptive warfare might not seem to be especially helpful. For one thing, preventive and preemptive war has been an enormously controversial part of the theory of war, although there is now more sentiment in favor of the view that there is some justification for some preemptive and preventive attacks. And borrowing from these are primarily due to Michael Walzer in his excellent book, Just and Unjust Wars. We might begin to specify the conditions for use of force without absolute certainty in attribution. One is that we might demand at least the best evidence we could reasonably expect in those cases, as opposed to the absolute certainty we've had in attacks of the past. And I've done some game theoretic simulations, and generally there's a lower level of violence altogether if you are 90% sure of your attacker or that an enemy will attack you. If it's less than that, you run the risk of just having counterattack and counterattack, all of them mistaken. Another issue is sort of last resort, or last epistemic resort, you might say, and that is that all other reasonable efforts at certain attribution have failed or been inadequate. Another condition for preemptive or preventive war is that there has to be increased danger of unjust harm by waiting. This is a condition we haven't heard mentioned, and that's last resort. So even in the case of a cyber counterattack, maybe it would be necessary to deter to do it immediately. And one condition I like is borrowed from Kantian ethical theory, and that's that the consequences of all major powers adopting a certain policy has to be better than the status quo. The status quo now being a case where we can attack each other and more or less hide behind the attribution problem. So if we could somehow reduce the total level of violence or cyber violence, that would be great. The last condition, I think, is interesting, and that is that we're all aware of the attribution problem, and our enemies are aware of the attribution problem too. So that if they are mistakenly attacked, we could justly say we had no way of knowing for absolute certainty that you were the attacker. Now, if we're morally squeamish about lacking certain attribution for counterattack, and I sort of take this step kind of reluctantly, another little discussed option is to counterattack or attack the pivot point, that is the network or computer system in the third-party nation. Now, that would seem quite strange in some ways, but in fact, usually when third nation systems are exploited, it's because of negligence on their part, unlicensed Windows systems, lack of antivirus software, and so forth. So this is what's weird, I think, is that we normally would think of the third-party nation as largely innocent, and that they might not even know they're being used by an attacking power. But there is this negligence issue. Now, a third way of compensating for this fact that they are relatively innocent, these third-party nations, is to give give warnings first to these third-party countries that have allowed their systems to be exploited. We might offer to identify and disinfect systems for them. Another condition would be that we'd have to use very, very strict proportionality. If we were to attack these third-party systems, we could only do so that would cause absolute minimal damage to the surrounding economy and even cyber context. We might make available much more than we do as sort of our foreign aid program, anti-malware software for computers, and we might train some of their technicians for cybersecurity if we notice nations have been prone to being used by other nations. Another possibility, this I understand is quite serious, the problem of unlicensed operating systems that have not had security patches made to them, but we might consider again as sort of a foreign aid program distributing licensed operating systems that work rather well and that can be patched. If a third nation is uncooperative after a warning, then we might prepare to attack them more or less under the doctrine that the Bush administration came forward with, and that's what I call the harboring doctrine. That is, if you harbor terrorists, if you knowingly harbor attackers on us, then we will consider it possible to attack you, at least to eliminate that attacker. Another possibility, which I haven't heard discussed, would be an information embargo on bad countries, either countries that are negligent in not protecting their systems or that are actually possibly doing the attacking. And that is, we might block internet traffic to or from the US from them. That's something, as was discussed this morning, various forms of economic embargoes are well within our means of soft force under Article 2. Another possibility, and for all I know this has actually been done, might be involuntary cleaning of operating systems and servers in countries. That is, we might use our own cyber competence not to damage them, but to correct them, even if they're not willing to do that or haven't done that yet themselves. The implications of this sort of proposal, I guess I've had two proposals. One is the reasonable certainty approach to counterattack, and then a deterrent strategy. And the second is going after the third-party nations to some degree and in a very measured way. What I've been discussing now is the third-party site also gives us some guidance about what we would do with non-state or patriotic hackers within another country. Namely, we could successfully argue in many cases that the country, the harboring country, has been negligent in blocking these attacks on our systems. Now, unfortunately, this would require the US to take steps, and we've never come close to doing anything like this. We would have to take steps to reduce the home front botnet attack on other nations, and we would have to require our own users and ISPs to employ the best techniques of malware attack. Many of the attacks in the world are of US-based systems on others. Another thing we could use is a rather obscure act that limits the ability of private individuals to conduct foreign policy. It's called the Neutrality Act, and it's under USC 18. There are only a handful of cases of its employment. Some of the larger problems of the attribution problem are, one, that foreign countries are not likely to give us the log data we would need to identify attackers on their servers. And if they did give it to us, we'd have a problem of a certainty that it's correct. Finally, the last problem I want to look at is just briefly, it's possible that it's not in the US interest to solve the attribution problem, because we are attackers sometimes as well as defenders. And it's even possible that a cyber arms treaty is not in the U.S. interest if, for instance, we'd have to be scrupulous about obeying it and other nations would not. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dipert. Our next panelist. Our next panelist is Dr. Neil Rowe. He is a professor of computer science at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. He has his degrees in electrical engineering from MIT and a PhD in computer science from Stanford University. His main research interests, as I understand it, are modeling of deception, information security, surveillance systems, image processing, and data mining. His more recent work has involved cyber warfare, digital forensics, actually, I guess, doing some of this attribution, and the problems of large-scale data analysis. And not only is he the author of a book on artificial intelligence, but has written over 160 technical papers and has been doing quite a lot of research, federally funded research in the last several years. So, Dr. Rowe.
Okay, so I'm the token computer scientist here. So my job is to tell you why it's a difficult problem in general to do attribution. But then inevitably I'm going to get into some policy issues towards the end here. So the main thing that I think was important with Richard Clark this morning was he pointed out the difference between criminal attacks and hacktivism and also espionage, and the sort of things that I think are the mission here, which is to look at nation-state sponsored types of activities. And there's going to be an important difference. And I really believe that attribution is much harder for the latter, for the state-sponsored stuff. So it may be true we are going to be able to get attribution on criminal attacks better and better in the future. There's going to be more and more international cooperation to track down people that are attacking us in criminal ways in whatever country they're in. But the main problem is the sort of things we're worried about here. So to use an analogy, in traditional warfare, we've got basically militaries wearing uniforms. We've got these nice facts that when there's an engagement, people are close to one another, right? So if you see things happening that are affecting you adversely, that you can usually attribute them to a particular adversary. And we've also got things like bullets and missiles, which have a nice direction to them. So you can tell usually where the missiles and bullets are coming from. And also, there's things like, generally there's a speed. If you get hit by a bullet, it's usually a few seconds after the bullet was fired. Also, another thing I didn't get to add to this slide is generally you can analyze the contents of things. So for instance, with IEDs, it's been very important once an IED explodes to analyze the materials of which it's made. And you can use that to get a clue who made it and what sort of things they might be up to next. Well, none of these things apply in cyberspace. So we no longer have any way to identify who we're dealing with in cyberspace, not any really good way. Also, attacks can be launched from some distance away, and even in cyberspace distance terms. There's issues with no clear direction. We don't know if things were coming from inside or outside or where they were going outside oftentimes. Attacks also can be very delayed or very slow, and so there's no immediate effects. You may have an attack that was set up years in advance, for instance. And as I say, with material, there's no way you can analyze the bits and tell that, in fact, it had some origin in some particular foreign country. So here's a standard diagram. I got to show you one diagram here. So this is the IP packet format. And so this is what most of the stuff on the internet is. There are a few other protocols that are similar that also have information. But you see down there in the fourth line, there's something called source IP address. Now, doesn't that look great, right? I mean, if we knew the source IP address, we could look it up in one of the many internet directories, and we'd know what country it was, right? So if that was true, we would have totally solved the attribution problem. So the problem is it isn't often true. Particularly with nation-state sponsored attacks, they're going to go to great lengths so that that data is not actually true. With criminal attacks, it may still give you a clue, even if it's been faked or something like that. See, what you can do with an attack is you can set it up on a computer that you own, and you don't have to run standard protocol software to generate these kinds of things. You can generate whatever addresses you want for source address and create these packets and send them out on the internet. And certainly, nation-states have the resources to do this kind of thing. So generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of problems trying to deal with this. So things could be faked. There's also, in many cases, the source address is just the last computer that's forwarding it. Not all the cases, though. More and more, you're actually getting the real addresses, which is often helpful. By the way, there is this new standard IPv6. That just means you're going to have a longer source IP address. It's not going to change the fundamental information there. So one thing that's often asked me is how do we backtrace? Can we backtrace these attacks? And there are techniques that can be used. These will be more successful against criminal cyber attacks, definitely, because computers do have to record information on each computer about things that have happened recently on them. So if you can catch the attack quickly enough, you can go to the last computer it came from and ask it for that information and ask then the previous computer where that information is. And you can do this actually with automated tools now. The DoD has plenty of tools like that. So the DoD can trace things quite quickly in their own networks. Problem is once it gets outside the DoD space, right, then we've got difficulties, particularly if it goes through countries that are not cooperative in cyberspace and tracking down cyber criminals and things like that. So we can do some of those things, but of course a nation state is going to go to lengths to make sure that if they're going to set up an attack, they want to have some bang for their buck. They're going to make sure that it's protected and cannot be traced in that particular way. Of course, one problem we have right today is that there is spoofing, and not all sites are supposed to check for fake addresses. When you get a packet coming to you, you're supposed to check whether the machine address, the MAC address, is consistent with the IP address, which is the sort of internet published address. And there's rules for the consistency of those things, and not all machines consistently check the consistency of those things. That requires external tables. It slows down your networking. You can't always do that for all cases. Also, there are things called anonymizer machines, too. So you can have, there are actual sites which sell the service where they will anonymize things. An anonymizer machine will throw away your IP address when you're coming in and send out a token one. And proxies are sort of a simpler form of that, but anonymizers try to scrub even better the packet data so it can't be traced. So certainly, if you're a small nation that wants to do cyber attacks, you should use anonymizers, and not in your country, too. Also, of course, there are countries that aren't cooperative. The path may be long for a serious cyber attack. So there are a whole bunch of problems involved with this backtracing stuff. However, there is a technology for it, and it will catch some cyber criminals, definitely, because cyber criminals can't go to all these links that a nation state can. Now, there are a number of innovative ideas that have to do with backtracing. So there's been a lot of research because it's such an important problem right now, the attribution issue. So one thing is to ping, or so-called, you send a message back to the person that's sending you packets if you think they're suspicious. And pinging can be a pretty good thing if you have a cooperative computer system. If it's a legitimate computer system, usually it will respond to a ping. But of course, if you're an attacker, you're not going to respond to pings. That could be one way to give away information about how you're doing. So it's not going to work against most of these attacks that we're worried about. You can also mark packets with signatures. So this has been proposed as part of the incoming packets. You mark them along the way. And this would require some sort of international cooperation if it goes through international space. But there are a number of things you can do that way that could be useful. So for instance, you could attach a signature. I'll say something about signatures. There's a well-understood technology of signatures in computers in cyberspace in various ways, and certainly in networking. And we could attach signatures to packets if we thought they were suspicious, and that would allow us to trace back at least where the signatures started being added, and that might be some help. Of course, another thing we can do is we could have sites all around the internet that are monitoring for suspicious activity that we could ask to collect information, see if they've seen a packet that looks similar. Main problem with that is there's a huge amount of data on the internet, and asking everybody to save a lot of data constantly in the hope that maybe once in a while we'd see a attack that we need to trace is unreasonable. However, there are some sites that are trying to do that. There are ways you can compress that data, so there are interesting technical problems, how you could compress it so people could save more of that data that they're doing things with. Of course, you could also try to trace things, attach signatures on the path back to the attacker. And so there are a number of people that are trying to do that. One way to do that is to use cookies. You know, the technology of cookies, which are things that are sent to your via to your web browser from a website to try to record information. And some criminal attackers are not watching for that sort of thing. Only problem with that isn't very good on attribution. It basically will just tell you it's the same person and not who that person is. So there are a bunch of things that we could use for doing that sort of thing. Also, by the way, there's hack back. So intelligence agencies like this idea, and some of my students like this idea. You basically try to break into some of the computers along a path and see if you can get some information if they're not being cooperative. But of course, that's illegal in most countries. So intelligence agencies could do it, but it wouldn't be reasonable to have a U.S. policy that does that all the time. Now, of course, one of the main problems with attribution is that there are also internal attacks, things that are close enough, even if they originated by a foreign government. At some point, if something's been sitting on your computer for a long time, it becomes an internal attack. And so that's one of the issues that I want to, that I think you really need to worry about with the attribution problem. An example would be through phishing. It's you could go back and look at emails, but the emails are probably not going to tell you anything about what country is responsible for a phishing attack. And we get plenty of these at my school all the time. We get lots and lots of phishing problems. You could also get infection spread from media and software also deliberately, that was deliberately designed to conceal malicious intentions. Of course, we get software from all over the world. We don't always know where the software was written. And also we could have espionage. We could actually have spies plant things on particular computer systems that are important. So with all those things, there is quite an interesting internal threat where we won't be able to get any attribution at all, basically, on the attack. And so, you know, I mean, there might be some issues with who benefits and stuff like that, but that's about the only way that you can do that. Of course, you can do stylistic. There have been some people trying to do stylistic analysis. So there are differences between how people write code, and you can analyze the code. And there are also sometimes comments, actually, in cyber attacks that you can look at the comments, see what language they're in. So what is happening in a lot of these weaker cases with internal attacks is you have to fall back on political and social justification for why you would think some nation would be responsible for it. So I don't think this is a very good trend, though. For instance, you know, Iran doesn't know it doesn't have good evidence for who's responsible for Stuxnet, so they're blaming both the United States and Israel. It would be nice if we had if they had some better basis for doing the attribution in that particular case. So one of the things I proposed elsewhere is to actually have deliberate attribution in all U.S. Cyber attacks, actually put in something there that would be a signature. And the whole trick, of course, is to do it so it's not obvious to the attacker that they're being attacked. Make it a signature that's hidden by techniques of steganography, for instance. Steganography is a way to conceal the very existence of a message in some other message, and there are a lot of good techniques available for doing steganography. So what you do is you'd have a signature, you'd use a private key, you use a public key, private key system, and the idea of the private key is that only you know the private key, but then there's a public key that decrypts, that everybody knows, and anybody could use that to confirm that you, if necessary. If you would point out how to do the steganography, if you would reveal after a particular attack what method you used in the steganography, nations could then do that and then read your signature and confirm that you were responsible for the cyber attack. So that might help a lot in cases of where you don't want to be blamed for something. So in general, I'm not a big fan of counterattack in cyberspace then because of these problems, because you can't really do attribution. It seems like attribution is key to justifying counterattack. I can't see that then we could have anything that's sort of like conventional war where there's attacks and counterattacks in a sequence like that. Instead, what we're going to end up in cyber war is a series of unconnected attacks where we think the adversary is responsible for something, so we'll counterattack them. And that's a very worrisome precedent in the history of warfare to have that sort of thing. So I'm basically not much of a fan of cyber warfare. Basically, I look at it as sort of similar to biological warfare, and yes, you could use that as an instrument of warfare, but the weapons are too hard to control. And of course, I've had in other things that I've written, I've also pointed out some of the other disadvantages of cyber weapons, that they've got random effects. They're very hard to control in what targets they hit. They quickly become obsolete, and then there's difficult damage repair on those. So in general, I'm skeptical of interest in attribution because I'm worried that, basically it doesn't have much defensive capability if we can attribute attacks. It doesn't really make difference to whether it's coming from China or Iran. If it's a cyber attack, we're not going to use any different techniques to defend against one nation as opposed to the other. They're going to use similar sort of attack techniques. So the only thing good I can see for attribution is we want to attack somebody else. But given all these problems with attacking other people and the lack of clear targets right now, I'm not a big fan of trying to do too much more with attribution. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rowe. So we're moving, I think, from the technical attribution into other questions of how would you attribute or what assumptions one might make. And our next panelist is Dr. Pano Yannakogeorgos, who is a research professor of cyber policy and global affairs at the Air Force Research Institute. He received his PhD in global affairs from Rutgers University, where he also served as a senior program coordinator heading their Center for the Study of Emergent Threats in the 21st Century. He also spent some time as an advisor within the UN Security Council on issues related not only to nuclear non-proliferation, but also Al-Qaeda and internet misuse. And his more recent research has focused on cyber international relations, as well as the national security and military operations issues that arise in cyberspace. And he's written a number of topics in this area, including strategies for resolving the cyber attribution challenge, which is forthcoming in the University Press, and an article I particularly have liked, which was called Cyberspace, the New Frontier and the Same Old Multilateralism, which dealt with the question of how nation states are going to deal with the question of what rules should coalesce around the use of military and other activity in cyberspace. Dr. Yannakogeorgos.
Thank you, Duncan. And thank you also to Ed and Colonel Athens and everyone else at the Stockdale Center. I'm going to talk today about using global policy responses to resolve the cyber attribution challenge. Can anyone hear me okay? No? Now? Okay. So bottom line up front, my main argument is that cyber attribution should not be focused as a technical challenge when we're trying to drill it down to the individual level in a military or national security context. We need to start holding nation states responsible for the behavior, for their own state behavior in cyberspace, but also for the actions of actors operating within their borders, regardless of whether or not they're origin or transit countries, for a cyber attack or a malicious cyber incident. To do this, we need to switch onto a model of sovereignty for cyberspace. So up on the slide, there's a graph of all the different elements of cyberspace. It's adapted from a work by David Clark out at MIT. So he has the first layer as the physical layer of cyberspace. That's the servers, the routers, the actual boxes, and the fiber optic cables underneath the seafloor. All of the physical components that have a physical routing somewhere on Earth. And they're all legally liable to some authority, whether it's the company that has the satellite up in orbit over which information is flowing. They're still liable legally to some country's laws on Earth, depending on where they operate. In the second green boxes, we have the data layer. So you have different sorts of networks and network topologies that exist out there, from open and fixed function networks like the internet, or closed and single function networks like air traffic control systems. Different kinds of attacks will target these systems differently, and the effects on these systems will be different depending on the motivation of the attacker. Going up to the information layer, in the pink box, we have more of the service-oriented stuff, software service, information as service. And again, here, information might be flowing, but it's created somewhere, whether it's malicious code or Gmail services. They're created somewhere, and they are still, the rule of law still applies to them. And then at the very top, you have the human operator. And the sole purpose of cyberspace is to enable humans to interact and also to create effects in the real world. And the humans that are producing all of the bottom layers are, again, liable to the rule of law within different countries. So in this context, the attribution challenge, as I see it, at least in my humble opinion, is that it's focused on the individual level rather than the nation-state level. So this is from Air Force document Doctrine 312 on cyberspace operations. And as we see in the red, the focus is on tracing back to an individual rather than to a country. And this, I think, at least in the national security and military context, is the root of the attribution challenge, applying the law enforcement and legal paradigms that are useful in criminal investigations to national security contexts. Of course, there are the technical realities which Dr. Rowe went over. This is one example of an anonymizing system. This is a Tor network. So the way a Tor network works is that Alice is trying to communicate to Bob anonymously because Alice doesn't want Bob to know where her location is. So she sends it through a number of pivot points that are located in different countries across the internet. Key here is different countries, encrypted connections, and Bob only knows the location of the last hop point. This creates a great challenge on the technical side because when Bob is trying to figure out where Alice is, he has to go through multiple jurisdictions to get to the source of Alice's attack, which leads us to the multi-stage and multi-jurisdictional challenge of the attribution problem. So the ecosystem within which cyber attacks occur is not isolated from the real world, as we went over in the cyberspace diagram. It's all rooted somewhere on Earth, and it's complicated. Cyber attacks are filtering through multiple countries. So we have not so much a technical issue. If you can get to the router data, we have an issue of international cooperation and getting different jurisdictions to cooperate in an investigation so that you can locate the source of an attacker. So if you can locate it down to the national level, then you can hold that nation accountable for either cooperating or not cooperating, and I'll be getting more into different responses for that later on in the presentation. A botnet is a prime example of a multi-stage, multi-jurisdictional attack. So it's multi-stage in that it infects, well, you have the bot herder who's sending out emails containing some sort of spearfish, a link to a website that has malicious code in it that then downloads malicious software onto the pink computers at the bottom, representing the bot. The bot master controls the computers and tells them to create some sort of effect on the internet. Bot herder, bot master could be in different countries. The command and control structure that they're using to communicate with the pink computers, which are distributed across several countries, complicates law enforcement efforts in the nature of attacks because the computer that's being used to exfiltrate some sort of data for the purpose of espionage or to conduct some sort of denial of service attack, you can't just trace it back to one computer, but you need to get back to where the bot master is, who's signaling, pressing the button and coordinating all the pink computers. So in terms of international cooperation, it's difficult to get to the ringleader of these networks because of the distributed nature of his command and control structure that he's using to control the pink computers. So that's the multi-stage nature, is that you're using complicated attacks in order to create an effect somewhere else in the world. That I don't want to get into the dynamics of different effects because you can have widespread destruction, you can have identity theft and other categories of effects that aren't just the typical military kinds of effects that we usually associate with cyber attacks. This diagram goes into the nature of a multi-stage, multi-jurisdictional attack. So red country has all the computer programmers who are creating the malicious code, sending it through West ANRIMS. I think that's the name that I have up there, yep. which is a country that has weak law enforcement abilities within its jurisdiction, which is the reason why the red country decided to filter the attack through there. And then the attack filters through the yellow country, which has been chosen because of its antipathy towards America. And once the attack reaches here, it creates some sort of effect in our country, whether it's widespread destruction or some criminal event. So in order for us to respond, we need to be able to know who did it, obviously. How do we get to the red country? You have to pass through all these less than likely countries to cooperate. But cooperation is possible even with countries that don't usually cooperate with us. So up here is a guy named Script. Script was a carding kingpin located in the Ukraine who had very close ties to the Ukrainian government. So the United States and the United States went to the Ukrainians and requested his extradition to America. We had located exactly who he was, where he was operating in his gun-wielding days, and the Ukrainians refused to cooperate. The Orange Revolution comes about 3 months afterwards. He's in jail for a couple of months, and then he's released because of his close connections with the Ukrainian party. He goes on to form the Internet Party of the Ukraine, and now he's a politician that's espousing an anti-American viewpoint to the rest of the world, to the rest of the Ukraine. So here's a case where we found a guy, told the government who he was. The government was not cooperating with the United States, and we eventually, even when they arrest him, he's still released due to his political connections. This leads into the, I only have 5 minutes left, so it deals to the issue of using global norms to not really force countries to cooperate, but to modify their behavior so that they're more likely to cooperate with the United States in cyber investigations in order to reduce the amount of ambiguous traffic that's flowing over the internet. Just to go into different levels of using global norms. So the idea is that in order for a global norm to take hold and actually modify behavior in countries, the global norm needs to be articulated by normatorpreneurs within international organizations and other governing bodies. It has to be institutionalized within an international organization, the patterns of behavior, and in order for it to succeed, I think it's point 4 up there, the United States needs to sponsor the norm and throw and we need to throw our resources into supporting the norm in order to actually make it an enforceable mechanism with which, under which we can hold states responsible. So that's the process of having a successful norms life cycle. It takes box 4, I think, in the presentation. So you have the articulation, consolidation, and then the American sponsorship of norms for cyber. So this is based on some research that I did with Simon Reich at Rutgers. Pretty much went through 3 different case studies showing that the trafficking in humans norm, anti-trafficking in human norm, is the best case example of when the U.S. has used its enforcement, its support of a global norm that's been institutionalized by the rest of the world to create changes in behaviors and in the ways state governments behave. So is this possible in cyberspace? I think it is. Currently, the UN General Assembly, well, over the past 10 years or so, the UN General Assembly has been promoting the idea of a global culture of cybersecurity within its within various General Assembly resolutions. Up on the board are the various principles of this global culture of cybersecurity, and we see one important one being response. So response can come in in the form of having one computer emergency response team being required to respond to another computer emergency response team's location in another country, request for information concerning a cyber attack. Problem is, the only one coordinating body that exists right now in the world is the International Telecommunication Union's IMPACT program. It's sort of a clearinghouse for information sharing among supporting nations. The U.S. is not a supporting nation for this, mainly because of our concerns with different countries that are trying to use this as a platform to stifle internet freedom. So the principles exist, institutions exist, and we might need to reform U.S. policy responses in order to start holding states accountable. This is one framework that I proposed. It's adapted. I've worked on this with Jason Healy over the Atlantic Council, taking his state levels of state responsibility theory, where you range from state when a specific action in cyberspace is prohibited, all the way down to as part of its integrated national strategy. So I've offered in the monograph that Duncan mentioned, I've offered a comprehensive treatment of what kind of development, diplomatic or defensive responses we can take depending on the level of state coordinated the level of state involvement in a cyber attack. So an example of development is that if a state is unable to cooperate with a law enforcement request, then the result would be that we offer them development aid or law enforcement training or something of that sort in order to enhance their capacities, so that if it happens again and we go to them and they still don't know who did it, we can ratchet it up to a diplomatic response in which we demarche them or take them to the Security Council. And then the defensive options are ones that are still could be discussed offline or during the question and answer session. So wrapping it up, this is a model tier 1 country, the kind of ideal country that if it exists, or if many of these countries exist, would limit the number of safe havens for cyber attacks to either originate or transit through. And that's the conclusion of this presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
So not a long introduction.
So yeah, I think that maybe I'll go with the last panelist needs no introduction. Martin Libicki,
What's no introduction?
Senior management scientist at RAND since 1998 and has written extensively on cyberspace issues. My own encounters have been with his work on deterrence, and I will, as he suggests, turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me literally across the alley from my office here over to here. I now invite you folks to close your eyes. A couple of reasons. First one is I don't have any PowerPoint slides, so you're not going to miss anything. Second of all, it's about 2 hours after lunch, and I know it does the human metabolism. But if any of you guys start to snore, you're just going to make me talk louder, so I just watch the whole snoring thing, okay? I want to basically make 5 points. The first point I want to make is that we have very little experience with cyber attacks. In the entire history of cyberspace, which is roughly about 20 years, we have had exactly 4 of them. One was a DDoS attack on Estonia in 2007. The second one was a DDoS attack on Georgia in 2008. The third, an iffy proposition, but let's assume it was the Israeli attack on Syrian nuclear site, whose cyber component consisted of knocking out a whole bunch of radar, if that's how it was done. And the fourth one was Stuxnet. Of these 4 examples, 2.5 of them were associated with violence, which meant that if you were going to retaliate against a cyber attack, you actually had a much better reason to retaliate. The 2 that were associated with violence was the Israeli attack on the Syrian radar and the DDoS attack. What? Thank you. And Georgia. And the half one is Estonia because it was a riot associated with the same cause that associated with the DDoS attacks. a lot of the thinking about the rule of law in cyberspace unconsciously or consciously reaches back to the DDoS attack. If DDoS attacks were the only sort of mischief you would perpetrate in cyberspace, I think I would have found myself another career a long time ago, because they're relatively harmless compared to the things that people really, really worry about. And if we're going to have a legal infrastructure, let's not look at that as a metaphor. And what I mean by that as a metaphor is, oh my God, I'm a neutral country and they're infecting computers in my country. Or I've been used as a transit for an attack. Or there's a particular server that I want to knock out, okay? We have to think a little, that the enemy is going to be a little more subtle than that. One of the characteristics of cyber war is that it's carried out by clever people. And a lot of the countermeasures that we talk about don't really work against clever people, and I'm going to go into point number 2. And that is, a lot of loose talk about active defense really makes no sense. Now that depends on your definition of active defense, and I'm going to talk about 2 definitions. One, which is what I think our DoD hierarchy is talking about, is the use of active espionage to try to go look for malware signatures. Perfectly acceptable, no problems with that at all. The one I think that other people, however, talk about is the actual attack of an attacking server. Now that makes a presumption, and that makes a presumption that there's an attacking server, okay? Well, let's take a look at Stuxnet. Was there an attacking server? And the answer is, if it was about 1.5 years before anybody discovered that there was something wrong, okay? Now, what about a DDoS attack? There's a guy in the keyboard commanding all his bots. If he's foolish enough to do that, he deserves to be taken out. But in fact, the technology has moved much, much farther. And now the more clever folks are talking about peer-to-peer command and control. Okay, it's not a trivial thing, but if we're talking about clever people can do this sort of, can do that sort of thing. There was some discussion about real-time attribution. Well, if you can't knock out the source of the attack, you don't need real-time attribution. Just like you don't need real-time attribution to prosecute a criminal case. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can wait 3 generations, okay? It really helps from a criminal point of view to get attribution fairly close in time before people forget what it is you're attributing. But it's not real time, which is the literal definition is as the attack is taking place. Okay? One other thing is it's extremely difficult, I would say for all practical purposes impossible, to disarm a cyber attacker by using cyber war. Real proof? There are basically 4 things you need to conduct cyber war. A machine, a network connection, a human hacker, and information inside the head of the human hacker, okay? 2 of those aren't going to be knocked out by definition. There's a network connection which you may be able to knock out, but if he's coming at you from within your own country, that could be a little problem. And in terms of knocking out a computer, there is some demonstration that you can do it. That's a relatively easy attack to defend against. And I won't go into details unless somebody has a question. Suffice it to say, that's not really possible. The kind of models we have for conventional warfare don't work very well when you're talking about cyberspace. Point number 3. There has been some comment about the asymmetry between defense and offense. Defense these days spends tens of billions of dollars. Offense doesn't spend nearly as much, as far as we know. Okay? I'd like to make 2 comments about that. One is that that's at relatively low levels of cyber war compared to the things we're really afraid about. It's not entirely clear that the curves are going to look the same if people start getting in behind their own electronic walls. Okay? Might not, I don't know, but you can't use the current statistics on the cost of offense and cost of defense to extrapolate linearly, because I think you're going to run into certain methodological problems. The second thing, which is a little more controversial, is I believe that most of the billions of dollars we spend are wasted when you're talking at the national or global scale. And the reason they're wasted is they're used by institutions to protect themselves. Let me give you an example. You have heard of a mid-sized company called Adobe. Last year, roughly 50 to 60%, last year, 2 years ago, roughly 50 to 60% of all the advanced persistent threat attacks used flaws in Adobe products. Wouldn't it have been more cost effective to get these guys to spend a little more money securing their products? Or a little more cost effective for us to look for holes in their products and then sort of ding on them saying, you got a vulnerability here, you got a vulnerability there, you got a vulnerability here? I would submit that that was so. That in fact, The systemic cause of cyber war is bad software. And if software were good enough, and we're talking about human perfectibility, so let's not get theological here, okay? But I think it can be a lot better. We wouldn't have nearly as much attacks, and the cost of defending against those that would be also reduced. Several other things that we ought to do, but we don't do. We try to defend everything. We don't do an assessment of what's important. A lot of people don't like to assess what's important because that actually ends up assessing the functions of other organizations, and it gets a little messy, but that's actually the first step in cyber war. A lot of people wringing their hands about the electric utility industry. What would be the cost of making these guys pull all of their wires off the internet? Remember, we used to do it that way, not so long ago. Okay? Could we do that again if we had to? The answer is yes. Would that get rid of the most critical potential 9/11 vector? The answer is yes. Would it cost tens of billions of dollars? I really doubt it. Okay? So my point is, yes, we spend tens of billions of dollars, and we spend it mostly in the wrong place. I see in the table in front of me 2 iPads. I want to make a note that it is possible to build a much more secure system than we have on average if you're willing to make certain architectural trade-offs. It's not that the guys at Apple are more clever than the guys at Microsoft. In fact, the evidence is the Microsoft guys are a little better at computer security. It's that Apple runs a closed system. They run it, by the way, to line their own pockets, which according to yesterday's report, they've been doing very, very successfully. But the side effect is that there is no known malware out there for iOS products. Now, somebody say, well, when there was enough of them. And I'm saying 300 million isn't enough? So, again, I'm not touting the genius of Apple, unless, of course, you own their stock and it's been doing well. Okay, but I am basically saying there are alternatives to explore that we haven't explored. Item number 4, attribution is inherently a political act. Just as cyber war is an inherently political act. It is not a legal act. It is not a case of how do we know we're in a cyber war? The answer is you know you're in a cyber war when it's to your advantage to know that you're in a cyber war, right? The same thing is true about attribution. How much confidence do I need? The question is, how much confidence do you think you need? At what point is the risk of getting it wrong going to overwhelm the risk of not getting it right, so to speak? That is an inherently political trade-off. If you're anybody here from Belgium, I'll pick on these guys for a minute, right? If you're Belgium and you're surrounded by friendly countries too deep on every side of you, you're going to have a different risk profile than if you're from Israel and you're surrounded by hostile countries all around you, okay? And the trade-off you make between being wrong and being right and not being the toughest guy in the neighborhood and being the toughest guy in the neighborhood is essentially a political act. Now, the next question is, and this has been debated for at least 15 years, is what's the point of attacking anonymously? Okay, well, it's to not get retaliated upon. But then the next question is, well, what can you do to attack anonymously? And the answer is, well, there are a number of things we know you can't do. You cannot take another person's capital anonymously. You can't. It's really difficult. I wouldn't try it. You know, don't try this at home. You really can't do a lot of coercion. It takes the edge off your coercion if you don't, you can't say do as I say without telling everybody who I is. Do as somebody says, please, or something like that, okay? Not going to work that way. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't uses, but I think we need a much more systematic examination of something I would call non-obvious warfare. Under what circumstances would you do things tantamount to war if you're not willing to say who it is you're doing and what it is you're doing it for? I'm not saying the answer is 0. I'm saying it's an underexplored area. Okay. 5 is the attribution question, which is, I guess, why you guys dragged me to the panel in the first place, right? Let me say a couple of things about that. We had Richard Clark this morning saying it's a lot better than we think, but I can't tell you because it's classified. Well, I'm sorry, Richard, I can't debate you on that one. But at least I can't debate you here on that one. I probably can't debate you anywhere on that one because I've made it a practice to stay as far away from classified information so that I can attend these conferences. But fair enough. By and large, if attribution is as good as it is, it's because the penalties for getting caught aren't very high. Have the Chinese been attacking us in the sense of stealing from us in cyberspace? You bet they have, right? oh, well, we're just an innocent country. We get attacked. You can hear these excuses till the cows come home. Guys, you did it. We know you did it. Everybody knows you did it. Everybody's complained that you've done it. Have you read the International Strategy from Cyberspace? Just because it didn't mention the word CHINA doesn't mean it wasn't about CHINA, guys. We all know it. And there are no consequences. Why are there no consequences? Well, because we are involved in a lot of relationships with them. They own $1.2 trillion worth of our debt. We'd like them to buy some more for the time being. Of course, that works both ways, you know. We'd like them to buy our products. We'd like us to buy their products. We educate a lot of their folks. We are hoping to make them a peaceful partner, in this world, and we might have a fair shot at doing that. So for all these reasons, you cannot take a look at the politics of dealing with China in cyberspace without looking at the broader overall politics. Now, you can argue that we've gotten it wrong, that they're an inevitable enemy of us, and the sooner we start feeling that way, the better. That's nice. It's for another conversation. We had a nice meeting on that a couple of weeks ago at the Academy on that. So I'll leave that for other conversation. But I mean, you cannot look at it in isolation. So let me ask the question, if you really wanted to hide your tracks, can you do so? And the answer is yes, if your tradecraft is good. China's is kind of mediocre. Russia's is good, ours is good, the Israelis are good, except they have a tendency to boast about their stuff, What do you want to do? First of all, you have to understand the risks, and you have to understand them systematically. Use very small cells. Employ people without a reputation of having been on hacker groups. Make sure they don't do stupid things from the intelligence point of view, like talk to their friends a lot. Okay? Item number 2, put them in a foreign country. Don't attack from your own country. The opportunities from attacking the United States from within the United States are probably better than from any other country in the world. We've got Wi-Fi everywhere. Right? We got anonymous cell phones. We got ID systems that are easy to spoof. We've got how many millions of our computers are actually somebody else's bots? Can rent them out. Okay? All sorts of ways you can keep yourself anonymous. And, oh, by the way, it's always nice to make it look like somebody else. That's one of the things that we forgot. Okay, it must be the Chinese because they look like that. Well, how do we know it isn't Taiwan? Okay, well, make it look like Taiwan. Or if you're Taiwan, make it look like China. In other words, put enough of the doubt in so you don't get to the kind of threshold that make you comfortable taking a political course. And I don't think that's all that hard to do. The reason we haven't seen it yet is because we haven't had the motivations yet. There's a story, I will say, from about 15 years ago. The RAND Corporation, I wasn't actually with them then, ran a small simulation called The Day After. And it was one of these attacks that clearly pointed to China, right? And so they had 7 groups, and they said, okay, guys, where did the attacks come from? 4 of them said China. 3 of them said Taiwan, trying to make it look to us like it was China. This stuff is tricky. So I think a lot of the assumptions about attribution, about deterrence, et cetera, really deserve a great deal of thought. This stuff is different. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, yeah, of course it's different. The 5th domain isn't exactly like the 4th domain, which in turn isn't exactly like the 3rd domain. But since they're all different from another, why not throw cyberspace in as a 5th domain? And then we play one of these Sesame Street games, which one isn't like the other. Sorry, guys, that's not the right way. You have to think of it from the first principles outward. And then if you want to integrate into military thought, you can. There is a tendency in the Department of Defense, in whose facility, of course, I'm sitting in, to see cyber attack within the rubric of war because that's what we do. And that's actually not as bad. You should see how DHS treats cyber. Last little anecdote. 4 largest parts of DHS, right? Customs and Border Patrol. What do they border protection. What do they do? Border Patrol, right? Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, that's illegal art. That's basically the permits part of Border Patrol. TSA, what does TSA do for a living? TSA guards the security perimeter around the departure gates. That's what they do for a living, right? Coast Guard, about large fraction of what the Coast Guard does for a living is guard the maritime border. So what does DHS do for a living? They do perimeter control. So then we assign cybersecurity to DHS. And what kind of a problem does DHS think cybersecurity is? No guesses. Perimeter control, which is why they're spending 2/3 of their money on Einstein, guys. When, I would argue, there are many more interesting places to spend that money. Okay. End of discussion. And I still have, within the golden, 5 minutes left.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Libicki. So with 4 panelists, we still actually have some time for some questions from the audience. Herb.
I thought this was a great panel, and one of the first panels that I've ever heard that didn't just wring their hands at the attribution problem. So thank you for that. I know that none of you mentioned the role of non-technical sources of intelligence, like SIGINT, HUMINT, and so on, playing in that. I was wondering if any of you might comment on that.
Well, some of the things I told not to do stupid things implied methods of HUMINT and SIGINT and things of that nature. In other words, you have to treat it as an intelligence problem, and you have to treat it, the attribution problem, as going against or going with, depending on what side you're on, the all sorts intelligence problem. One of the reasons you use small cells is because the larger the cell, the greater the chance of human penetration.
I had a slide that did mention it.
Okay. But do you think let me ask you, do you think that it's a significant, that HUMINT and SIGINT are significant sources of intelligence for dealing with the attribution problem?
I think they could be, yeah. I mean, that it would require CIA getting together with NSA in the case of HUMINT, but yes.
I think Semantic is doing some interesting work too on the human SIGINT stuff in the private sector in determining attribution of the various sources of malware. I can talk to you afterwards. Yep.
Yes.
George.
Oh, George, are you still?
No, let's go back here. Yeah. So we hear this deterrence, and also Admiral Rogers said in the morning it takes time for things to evolve. I mean, it took 25 years to understand that the tank actually had a use by itself versus the mobile pillbox. And we're talking about deterrence, and it's like accountability and transparency. Everybody says it, everybody likes it. Nobody has a way to do it. And I was thinking about deterrence here. The only way I can see deterrence is that you build up a massive capacity and you show ability. Will can always change. It's like nuclear. I mean, the reason why nuclear deterrent is, as Kenneth Walt says, nuclear is not what you do with it, it's what you can do with it. So if you have to build up an ability, a capacity, or defensive capacity, use that as a deterrence, and rescue it. Use that as a deterrent power. I can't really see another way of doing deterrence. That's me.
So I guess a question of how deterrence crosses over and affects attribution is it? I mean, that presumes this goes to, I guess, the question of whether some signaling would be necessary to have a deterrent capacity. I don't know if any of the panelists.
Yeah, like any country that's got Pearl Harbor and then the reaction to 9/11 under its belt does not have to say anything more about deterrence. It has communicated effectively that if we're sufficiently irritated, we will go out and do some very violent things.
But it's an idle threat. It's an idle threat if you can't pin culpability down on it. If you can't, in some way, shape, or form over time, either using the entire interagency to build target folders to go after someone who you've identified who's really after you. I mean, otherwise you can say, yeah, when we find out, you don't want to wake the sleeping giant. But if the sleeping giant's snoring on the attribution piece or the forensics piece, to be able to pin down culpability, the greatest deterrence tools, the attack tools in the world, unless we're doing a preemptive attack before we do a physical attack on our own. But I mean, having those attack tools, they're just going to collect dust. And we ran into it on the nuclear piece, on the deterrence, trying to make sure we had the forensics to be able to identify where the precursors all came from. And that was part of the deterrence policy. But it seems that piece is missing here. I agree, we got the will, you don't want to piss us off. I got it. I think the world understands that. But if we're never going to be able to figure who is it that we want to unleash the dogs of war on, you don't really have a deterrence policy.
It's not what you can do. It's what the other guy thinks you might be able to do that gives you deterrent policy.
Well, I mean, if he's in this room right now, he's doing the chicken dance because
I trust everybody's room.
But I guess what have we put out there? Part of perception is reality. There's been some things we want people to think we have the capability to do that we put out as policy, not getting into it, but I'm not hearing or seeing any of that in this arena.
I just don't want to be the guy who's going to try to explain to the guys at the Politburo, oh no, they'll never catch us.
Anybody else want to take a crack at it on the, I mean, without being able to pin blame, I just don't think you have deterrence.
Well, I think that Dr. Libicki impressed on me at a previous conference that there are many conditions for deterrence. There's a minimum rationality. There has to be an ability to be harmed, which, say, North Korea might not have. Plus all kinds of information exchange. And as you pointed out, there has to be both attribution and a demonstration of your capacity to inflict harm on someone else. And it's true, for now, those things are all missing. I've heard many people brag about the U.S. offensive arsenal, but other than perhaps Stuxnet, I have not seen any demonstration. That means the rest of the world hasn't either.
I'll just take the chair's prerogative and add, I mean, I think one of the other things when we talk about deterrence and the difficulty that attribution poses is there are different forms of deterrence for different actors. And, you know, what we're talking here is the nuclear deterrence analogy is you're trying to deter state actors, and there's certainly a big piece of this, but they're not the only people that you have to be focused on in this game. And so that's part of the problem, is how do you deal with the fact that, you know, whether you call it chew or whatever, that you've got multiple actors, many of whom have capacities, and you know, every time we think there's only some attack and it has to have come from a state. Remember, Solar Sunrise is my favorite in '98, where the Defense Department was convinced it was coming from Iraq or Iraqi sponsored, and it was, you know, 3 teenagers, 2 of whom in California. Now, obviously, Stuxnet, everyone has said that could only have come from a state, and maybe it's true, but you know, there are some fairly sophisticated private actors out there, and I've heard the costs of Stuxnet were calculated. I talked to some folks in Germany, said $3 million tops was what it probably cost to put together. And when you compare that to some of the other things that, you know, the U.S. military would normally do, that's dirt cheap. So I think when you think about deterrence, part of it is what kind of deterrence are you seeking, and who are you trying to deter? So, George, I'm going to give you, oh, you're still deferring. All right.
My understanding, stated public U.S. policy, the critical aspect of deterrence, its credibility, is we will not just simply restrict ourselves responding to a cyber attack with cyber weapons. Absolutely. We have a panoply of things we can do, okay? And second of all, unless we publicly admit, back to Libicki's comments, that we are totally unable to account for that, they don't know. I mean, this is a country that took down a country that we thought had nuclear weapons that didn't have it. So you could say that just because, unless we continue to run around saying we have absolutely no capability of identifying you, I still think there's pretty significant deterrence capacity based on stated policy and based on how anonymous do you really think you are.
And also that leaves them in the uncertainty. Once you have the capacity, you don't know who to deal with.
So maybe this is more of a comment, and you respond if you like, but Herb praised you all for not wringing your hands over the attribution problem. Let me wring my hands over the contradictory advice we've gotten so far today and see if I understand where we are. We have probably one of the leading cyber forensics experts and computer scientists here in the country saying the attribution problem is hopeless. It's really, really difficult and tricky, and it renders cyber war itself and cyber conflict kind of useless because it's just sort of indiscriminate violence against unknown adversaries and ending up doing a lot of damage and not necessarily punishing anybody. And that directly contradicts our morning speaker, as Martin pointed out, that Clark told us that we have the attribution problem solved, and those of us in the know, which I'm not, can be confident that we've got this all under wraps and keys, and we're in pretty good shape. Then you go to Dipert, probably one of the most influential voices on the ethics side, who says the attribution is problematic, but 90% certainty is probably close enough for government work, so kill them all and let the And Pano, who's a brilliant young cyber analyst down with the Air Force Research Institute, telling us that you know, this is really a lawless kind of realm down there, but and attribution is problematic, but we can encourage responsible state behavior and emergence of good norms. Only if we ignore the final panelist, Martin Libicki's comment about the kinds of things it would take to have the funds to do that, which would be care enough politically about the damage from the people we know are doing it, to overcome our political reluctance to make them pay. And otherwise, the kind of damage that's getting done is so sort of small potatoes, it's not worth worrying about. Where are we at all?
If we all agreed, wouldn't 3 of us be redundant?
Certainly would be the case. So what do we make of all of this? It sort of reminds me of that Irish play a few years ago, Stone's Pocket, when the 2 characters at the very end just kind of confront the meaninglessness of everything and say, well, Shamus, let's admit it, we're fucked. We're totally fucked.
And the whole idea is to be thought-provoking, and believe me, this was thought-provoking. As a matter of fact, I'm going to contact USAA or a Navy Federal Card. I'm going back to paper statements tomorrow. I'm scared to death here, but I mean, really, even though contrary, that's what we're here to hear about. Discourse isn't about one opinion or the same statement heard 4 or 5 times across the panel. I think we got a hell of a lot out of this. Some of us probably are a little scared out, coming out of it. And having been in the policy arena as the J5 for 2 years and trying to develop deterrence policy and trying to get the interagency to agree on when you throw a punch and what's deterrent and who wants ambiguity in the deterrent policy and who wants to, to be clear and precise. If you do X, we're doing Y. And I mean, in our own government, we all have different opinions on that within the National Security Council. So, on behalf of again, Colonel Athens, who had to go ahead and leave in the Stockdale Ethical Leadership Center, I want to thank you very much, and I'd like everybody to please join me in a warm round of applause.